Hello, everyone, and welcome to another video here on Kelvin Wazoo. We're going to do another one today on the genealogy of music. This is number 2 in that series, and we're going to talk about a drummer, Jim Gordon. Now, Jim Gordon, I first heard about him on a Frank Zappa album, and that would have been the album Apostrophe. So he shows up, all about Apostrophe, one of the more widely selling, bigger selling albums that Zappa produced. And Jim Gordon is the drummer on the title song, Apostrophe. Jack Bruce playing bass. There's a little interesting story about that whole thing because apparently Frank wanted Jack Bruce to play a cello, and Bruce didn't bring his cello. So there was so they ended up creating this jam, Apostrophe, which is really a killer jam. And Jim Gordon on drums is just phenomenal. Then I also found out that Gordon toured with Zappa during from about 1972. It was during the 1972 Petit Wazoo tour. He actually was with the Grand Wazoo and the Petit Wazoo tour. The Petit Wazoo tour shows up on this limited release CD, Imaginary Diseases. And Gordon's drumming on this is just really, really incredible. He shines on the song Bend to Kansas City in A minor. He has a killer solo in Farther Oblivion, which has no relation to Father Oblivion, from Apostrophe. And then he's also on DC Boogie. And then Frank also has some just really surprising, great guitar riffs and solos in here. And in fact, they kind of, I have a blog that's called Frank Zappa's Revenge that I haven't updated in like 5 or more years, but you can still find it by Googling Frank Zappa's Revenge. It should show up. But I remember, and I looked it up again, writing about this and the amazing guitar playing that Zappa did, and you could hear on this particular release. I wrote that it would make Greg Allman weep. and Gordon sounds like he's two drummers. I mean, he is just maniacal on this tour. So really great stuff that's been going on here. It's almost like they connected musical brains, Zappa and Gordon. They just played so well together. But then you might ask, well, then why do we not see Jim Gordon on more, particularly subsequent albums that came later with Frank Zappa? When in fact, he ended up working with Terry Bossio and some others. Well, there's kind of a it's a really interesting backstory with Jim Gordon that kind of ends tragically. So we'll go all the way back to when Jim Gordon was 17. All right, when he was 17, this was back in 1963, he was a session drummer with the Everly Brothers. And after that, he quickly became one of the most sought after session drummers in the business. So, for example, in 1966, he did some drumming with the Beach Boys on Pet Sounds. So, got that one here, which again is considered to be a really important breakthrough album for the Beach Boys. So he was a session drummer on that one. He also was with on the album Notorious Bird Brothers, which was released by the Byrds in 1968. He was on Classical Gas by Mason Williams in 1968. And he was so busy. He was also doing a gig at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas as a session drummer there during, their shows, their cabaret shows or whatever. And he was in such demand that he would fly back and forth between LA and Las Vegas. He'd fly to LA, drum during a recording session, and then fly back in time so that he could do his gig at Caesar's Palace. So, yeah. Well, then in 1969 through 1970, he toured with Delaney and Bonnie, and you can hear him on, the album Motel Shot. Um, so, which had a lot of other people like Bobby Whitlock, Eric Clapton. A lot of these guys were on there too, and he was also, you can hear him on this one too by Delaney and Bonnie on tour with Eric Clapton, as you can see. So he was with them touring, and I got a bunch of notes about this because it's a really interesting story. Eric Clapton sort of absconded with the entire rhythm section that Delaney and Bonnie had gathered together, and that included Gordon and Bobby Whitlock and some others. And he took that group, and that's how he formed Derek and the Dominoes. Now, Derek and the Dominoes, you may recall, released a very big, album, but they had another job they did first before they even did this later album that I will mention. And that was they were the studio band for George Harrison on All Things Must Pass. So Clapton, Bobby Whitlock, Jim Gordon, and others, this was 1970. They were there in that. And then it was after that, roughly the same year, that they ended up producing this album, Layla, and other assorted love songs. Now, another little interesting fact here about the song Layla, the piano coda at the end, that's Jim Gordon playing the piano. So, he was more than just a drummer. But this is kind of where things were perhaps starting to get a little weird with Jim Gordon, because he allegedly stole the melody from that coda from his former girlfriend. And there are several people who have been interviewed and know, yes, he was playing her music, and he didn't give her any credit on the album when that was recorded. So, what's going on with him? I mean, allegedly also he punched her or something during a tour, and that's what led to their breakup. So he had some issues. But nonetheless, he continued to be a session drummer and play with a lot of really big names. He went on and recorded some tracks with Joe Cocker on this album, Mad Dogs and Englishmen. And then he also toured with Traffic, and he has also appears on tracks on the album Low Spark of High Heeled Boys. In fact, he is, I believe he is does the drumming on Low Spark of High Heeled Boys. So not every Traffic song is necessarily, the percussion is necessarily provided by Jim Capaldi. Then it was roughly 1972. That's when he connected with Frank Zappa and the Petit and the Grand Wazoo bands that toured. The Petit Wazoo was a 10-member band, and that was half the size of the Grand Wazoo band. So that was 20 people in that one. And then, so things, started to get a bit dark uh, with Jim Gordon. He continued to do some other, work. I don't have albums for these, but he played with Johnny Rivers, and he did most of the tracks, drummed on most of the tracks for Steely Dan, Pretzel Logic, including Ricky Don't Lose That Number, which I have on, Steely Dan Greatest Hits. And then he also did 3 tracks on Alice Cooper Goes to Hell. So busy, busy, busy guy. All right, but now he was mentally disintegrating. There were reports, that he might be schizophrenic, that he was hearing voices, but he was misdiagnosed, apparently, according to some reports. The doctors thought the primary issue was alcoholism, so they referred him for treatment for alcoholism. That apparently was not the issue. And then in 1983, he very brutally murdered his mother, killing her with a hammer and knife. And he said that voices were telling him to do this. So he was sentenced to prison for 16 years. He had parole hearings, but he was still very psychologically unstable. His second or third hearing, he didn't even show up for it. He said he was still hearing voices. He still maintained. And in one of the hearings, he said his mother was still alive. No, she's not dead. She's still alive. So the last reporting that I saw about it would have been in 2018, in which he was still incarcerated in a Southern California facility. Tragic story, but man, what a drummer. He was really, really skilled. So when you listen to these albums, listen to the drumming. Some of the drumming is, really out there and very strong, but some of the drumming is just very simple timekeeping, just really great timekeeping. What a drummer needs to do. It's not always, crazy flamboyance, but he was very capable of that as well. So, that's the second episode of the Genealogy of Music, looking at the drummer, Jim Gordon, and all the connections that he had. As I said, I first heard about him with Frank Zappa, but what a storied career he had with all the different people that he played. I hope that was informative for you. Be sure to check out in the Down Under. I'll have a link to the previous episode of the Genealogy of Music. I hope you show up for future episodes of Calvin Wazoo. And as always, remember, enjoy the music.